The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace glittered under thousands of crystal lights. Guests in their finest evening wear moved gracefully across the marble floor, their conversations creating a gentle hum that mixed with the soft music from the string quartet. Tonight was different from the usual state dinners and formal receptions. This was a private celebration for the royal family, marking the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's coronation. Charles stood near the ornate fireplace, his military dress uniform perfectly pressed, medals gleaming on his chest. At 75, he carried himself with the dignity expected of a king, though those who knew him well could see the weight of recent months in his eyes. The transition from prince to monarch had been smoother than many expected, but it came with challenges no one could have predicted. Kate moved through the crowd with natural grace, her emerald green gown catching the light as she spoke with various guests. As the Princess of Wales, she had grown into her role beautifully over the years. Her warm smile and genuine interest in others made her beloved by both the public and those within palace walls. Tonight, however, something seemed different about her demeanor. There was a thoughtfulness in her expression, a careful consideration in how she chose her words. Camilla sat in an elegant chair near the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. The queen consort wore a deep blue dress that complemented her silver hair, styled perfectly as always. She held a crystal glass of champagne, though she had barely touched it throughout the evening. Her eyes followed the movements of the other guests, but her mind seemed elsewhere entirely. Those who approached her found her responses polite but brief, lacking her usual engaging conversation. The evening had begun like any other royal gathering. Family members arrived in order of precedence, greeting each other with the formal kisses and handshakes that protocol demanded. William and Kate entered together, their children having been settled upstairs with their nannies. The younger royals mingled with cousins and family friends, creating pockets of laughter throughout the room. As the night progressed, Charles found himself drawn to conversations about the future of the monarchy. Several guests, including longtime advisors and foreign dignitaries, shared their thoughts on the challenges facing royal institutions worldwide. The topics ranged from public opinion polls to the role of social media in shaping public perception. Charles listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. Kate noticed how these conversations seemed to energize Charles. Despite the formal setting, she could see him becoming more animated as he discussed his vision for a modernized monarchy. His passion for environmental causes, his interest in interfaith dialogue, and his commitment to charitable work all emerged in these exchanges. It reminded her of why she had always admired her father-in-law's dedication to service. The palace staff moved seamlessly through the crowd, ensuring glasses remained filled and that small appetizers circulated regularly. The head butler, a man who had served the royal family for over 30 years, kept a careful eye on the flow of the evening. He noticed the subtle dynamics between family members, the way certain conversations seemed to create invisible tensions in the room. As the evening reached its midpoint, a photographer captured family portraits in the blue drawing room. The formal shots required precise positioning, with everyone standing according to protocol. Charles stood at the center, with Camilla to his right and other family members arranged by their place in the line of succession. These photographs would appear in newspapers and magazines worldwide, representing the stability and continuity of the British monarchy. During a brief break between formal activities, Kate found herself in conversation with several charity representatives. These were organizations she had supported for years, focusing on early childhood development and mental health awareness. The discussion became deeply engaging as they shared recent research findings and discussed new initiatives that could make a real difference in people's lives. Charles observed this conversation from across the room. He had always been impressed by Kate's genuine commitment to her charitable work. Unlike some royal patronages that existed mainly for publicity, her involvement was substantive and well-informed. She asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from previous meetings, and consistently pushed for innovative approaches to complex social problems. The string quartet transitioned to a new piece, something more contemporary that reflected Charles's interest in supporting modern composers alongside traditional classical music. The change in tempo seemed to shift the energy in the room slightly. Younger guests began moving closer to the music, while older attendees continued their conversations in quieter corners. Camilla remained in her chair by the windows. Though she had turned slightly to better observe the room, her position gave her a clear view of most of the gathering, and she used this vantage point to study the interactions between different family members. Her experience in royal life had taught her to read the subtle communications that occurred beneath the surface of formal events. The conversation between Kate and the charity representatives had grown more intense. They were discussing a particularly challenging case involving a family affected by mental health issues. Kate's questions showed both compassion and a sophisticated understanding of the systemic problems that contributed to such situations. Her ability to connect policy discussions with human stories made her an effective advocate for causes she supported. Charles excused himself from his current conversation and began moving across the room. His path seemed casual, but those who knew him recognized the purposeful way he navigated between groups of guests. He paused briefly to exchange pleasantries with an elderly duke, complimented a young woman on her charitable work, and acknowledged a foreign ambassador with appropriate diplomatic courtesy. As Charles approached the area where Kate was engaged in her animated discussion, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift subtly. The palace staff, trained to notice such things, positioned themselves to ensure privacy while maintaining their duties. The photographer, who had been capturing candid moments throughout the evening, sensed something significant might be about to occur. The charity representatives, recognizing that a private family moment might be approaching, gracefully concluded their conversation with Kate. They expressed their gratitude for her continued support and promised to follow up with the detailed proposals they had discussed. Kate thanked them warmly, her genuine appreciation evident in both her words and her expression. Now Charles stood just a few feet from Kate, close enough that their conversation would be private, despite the crowd around them. The music continued. Other guests carried on their discussions, and the evening maintained its elegant flow. Yet something in the air suggested that whatever Charles was about to say would be significant, not just for Kate, but for everyone present who understood the complex dynamics of royal family relationships. Charles stepped closer to Kate, his expression serious yet warm. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade around them as he leaned slightly toward her. His voice was low, meant only for her ears, but the weight of his words would soon ripple through the entire room in ways no one could predict. "Kate, there's something I need to discuss with you," Charles began, his tone carrying the gravity of someone about to share information that would change everything. "The doctors have given me their final assessment. The treatments aren't working as well as we hoped." Kate's face remained composed, though those watching closely might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. She had suspected that Charles's recent medical appointments were more serious than the palace had publicly acknowledged. The official statement spoke of routine checkups and minor procedures, but family members had begun to notice subtle changes in his energy levels and daily routines. "How long?" Kate asked quietly, her training in royal protocol helping her maintain an outward calm, even as her mind raced through the implications of what Charles was telling her. "Months, not years," Charles replied, his voice steady despite the devastating nature of his words. "The constitutional lawyers are already preparing the necessary documents. William will need to be ready sooner than any of us anticipated." Across the room, Camilla sat frozen in her chair by the windows. Though she couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged between Charles and Kate, she could read the body language with devastating clarity. After years of marriage to Charles, she understood his expressions, his gestures, and the way he held himself when delivering difficult news. The realization of what was being discussed hit her like a physical blow. The crystal champagne glass in Camilla's hand began to tremble slightly. She set it down on the small table beside her chair, her movements careful and deliberate. Her years of public service had taught her to maintain composure in difficult situations, but this was different. This was personal in ways that transcended duty and protocol. Charles continued his conversation with Kate, unaware that his wife had pieced together the situation from across the room. "The transition must be seamless," he explained. "The public cannot sense any instability, especially with everything happening globally right now. William and you will need to gradually take on more responsibilities, but it must appear natural, planned." Kate nodded, understanding the delicate balance required. The monarchy's strength lay in its perceived permanence and stability. Any hint of crisis or sudden change could undermine public confidence and provide ammunition for Republican movements that questioned the relevance of the royal family in modern society. "Does William know?" Kate asked, thinking of her husband who was currently engaged in conversation with several members of Parliament near the grand piano. "Not yet," Charles admitted. "I wanted to speak with you first. Your perspective on how to handle this has always been valuable. You understand both the public relations aspects and the human elements involved." The conversation between Charles and Kate had drawn the subtle attention of several palace staff members. The head butler, with his decades of experience, recognized the signs of a significant private discussion. He quietly signaled to other staff to ensure that no one would interrupt or come too close to overhear. Meanwhile, Camilla's composure was beginning to crack. The woman who had faced decades of public scrutiny and media attention, who had weathered scandals and transformed her public image through dedicated service, found herself struggling to maintain control. Her breathing became slightly irregular, and she pressed her lips together to prevent any sound from escaping. The queen consort's mind raced through memories of recent months. Charles's increased fatigue during long ceremonial events, the way he had begun delegating more responsibilities to William and Kate, the private medical appointments that he insisted on attending alone, the late-night conversations where he spoke more frequently about legacy and the future of the monarchy. Charles placed a gentle hand on Kate's arm. "There's something else," he said, his voice even quieter now. "I'm considering making an announcement after the summer. A gradual transition that allows William to step into the role while I'm still here to guide him. It's unprecedented, but these are unprecedented times." Kate understood the magnitude of what Charles was proposing. Unlike his mother, who had remained on the throne until her death, Charles was contemplating abdication while still alive. It would reshape the monarchy and require careful constitutional navigation. The decision would affect not just the immediate royal family, but the entire Commonwealth and the relationship between Britain and its former colonies. "The children," Kate said, thinking of George, Charlotte, and Louis. "They'll need time to adjust to what this means for their futures." "Of course," Charles agreed. "George especially will need preparation for what lies ahead. But you and William have done an excellent job of giving them as normal a childhood as possible. That foundation will serve them well." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were discussing the end of one reign and the beginning of another in the middle of a celebration, honoring the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's coronation. The woman who had defined duty and service for over 70 years would have understood the difficult decisions her son now faced. Camilla watched as other guests continued their conversations. Oblivious to the life-changing discussion happening just meters away, she observed William laughing at something a young earl had said, completely unaware that his life was about to transform in ways he couldn't imagine. The weight of what she knew and what others didn't created an almost unbearable sense of isolation. The string quartet finished their current piece and paused briefly before beginning a new selection. In that moment of relative quiet, Camilla's barely controlled emotions threatened to overwhelm her. A single tear escaped, rolling down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. She hoped no one had noticed, but the gesture hadn't escaped the attention of a keen-eyed lady-in-waiting standing nearby. Charles and Kate's conversation was drawing to a close. They had covered the immediate practical concerns, the timeline for various announcements, and the need for careful coordination with government officials. Both understood that this information would remain strictly between them until Charles was ready to expand the circle of those who knew. "Thank you for trusting me with this," Kate said, her voice conveying both the honor and the burden of being included in such momentous decisions. "Your family," Charles replied simply, "and you'll be queen consort sooner than anyone expected. Your voice in these decisions is not just welcomed, it's essential." As their private conversation concluded, both Charles and Kate began to transition back into their public roles. They would need to circulate among the guests, maintain the celebratory atmosphere, and ensure that no one suspected the gravity of what had just been shared. The evening must continue as planned, a perfect royal gathering that revealed nothing of the seismic changes ahead. The revelation shared between Charles and Kate began to ripple through the evening, in subtle ways that only the most observant would notice. Kate's demeanor shifted slightly as she processed the enormity of what she had learned. While she maintained her gracious public persona, moving from group to group with practiced ease, Those who knew her well might have detected a new thoughtfulness in her responses. William remained oblivious to the conversation that had just occurred, continuing his animated discussion with members of Parliament about rural development initiatives. His passion for the subject was evident as he described successful projects in Cornwall and Wales. The irony was striking. Here was a man discussing long-term plans and future goals, unaware that his own future was about to change dramatically. Charles moved away from Kate with the smooth transitions that royal training demanded. He approached a group of Commonwealth ambassadors, seamlessly joining their conversation about trade relationships and cultural exchanges. His ability to engage meaningfully with complex policy discussions remained sharp, giving no hint of the personal turmoil he was managing internally. Camilla struggled to regain her composure as the reality of the situation settled over her. She had suspected something was seriously wrong with Charles's health, but confirmation hit differently than speculation. The woman who had spent years supporting her husband, through the challenges of his role, now faced the prospect of watching him step away from the position that had defined his entire life. The lady-in-waiting who had noticed Camilla's momentary lapse approached discreetly. Lady Margaret Thornbury had served the royal family for over 2 decades and possessed the kind of intuitive understanding that made her invaluable during difficult moments. She positioned herself nearby, ready to provide support if needed while maintaining the appearance of casual attendance. "Your Majesty," Lady Margaret said quietly, using the respectful address while keeping her tone conversational. "Perhaps you'd enjoy some fresh air? The gardens are particularly lovely this evening." Camilla understood the offer for what it was, an opportunity to step away from the crowd and collect herself without drawing attention. However, she also knew that leaving the ballroom at this point might raise questions. Royal protocol demanded that she remain present for the duration of the evening, unless there was a compelling reason to depart. "Thank you, Margaret," Camilla replied, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I'm quite comfortable here for now." The exchange was brief and would seem unremarkable to any casual observer, but it established a communication channel between Camilla and her support staff. Lady Margaret would remain alert to any signs that the Queen Consort needed assistance managing the emotional demands of the evening. Kate found herself in conversation with Prince Edward and Sophie, discussing their upcoming charitable engagements. The conversation felt surreal given what she now knew about the family's future, but she participated naturally, even offering suggestions for collaborative events. Her ability to compartmentalize her emotions while maintaining royal duties would prove essential in the months ahead. Kate seems particularly engaged tonight, Sophie observed to Edward during a brief lull in their conversation. "There's something different about her energy." Edward nodded, though he couldn't quite articulate what he was noticing. As the youngest of Charles's siblings, he had developed a sensitivity to family dynamics that served him well in navigating the complexities of royal relationships. Tonight he sensed undercurrents that he couldn't identify, but that set him slightly on edge. Charles had moved on to speak with several senior military officers, men and women who had served with distinction in various conflicts around the world. This was always one of his favorite aspects of royal events, the opportunity to honor those who had sacrificed for their country. Tonight, however, the conversations carried additional weight as he considered his own legacy of service. The photographers continued their work throughout the evening, capturing what they believed to be a routine royal gathering. They had no way of knowing that they were documenting a historic moment, one of the last major family events before everything would change. The images they captured would later be scrutinized for any hints of the drama that was unfolding beneath the surface. William glanced across the room and noticed his stepmother sitting alone by the windows. Something in her posture struck him as unusual. Though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what seemed different, he excused himself from his current conversation and began making his way toward her, stopping to exchange brief pleasantries with guests along the route. "Camilla," William said warmly as he approached her chair. "You look beautiful tonight, but you seem a bit quiet. Everything all right?" His genuine concern was evident in his voice. Over the years, William had developed a respectful and caring relationship with his father's wife, appreciating her loyalty to Charles and her dedication to royal duties. He had seen how happy she made his father and had come to value her practical wisdom and dry sense of humor. Camilla looked up at William, seeing in his face the same strong features that characterized both Charles and George. The genetic continuity of the monarchy was evident in these facial similarities, a visual reminder of the institution's permanence even as individual reigns came and went. "Just taking in the evening," Camilla replied, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "These gatherings are wonderful, but sometimes it's nice to observe rather than participate constantly." William accepted her explanation, though something in her tone suggested there was more to her mood than simple fatigue. He had learned to read the subtle communications that occurred within royal family dynamics, understanding that direct emotional expression was often discouraged in favor of more restrained approaches. "Father seems in good spirits," William observed, glancing toward where Charles was engaged in animated conversation with the military officers. "He's been particularly energetic lately with all the new initiatives he's been launching." The comment hit Camilla like a knife. William's innocent observation about his father's energy highlighted how well Charles was concealing his true situation. The man she loved was facing a devastating diagnosis while maintaining a public facade of vitality and engagement. The strength required for such deception was enormous, and she felt a surge of admiration mixed with heartbreak. "Yes, he's been quite focused on his work lately," Camilla agreed, her voice carefully neutral. "He's always been dedicated, but recently there's been an almost urgent quality to his commitments." William nodded, interpreting her words as praise for his father's work ethic, rather than recognizing the deeper meaning she couldn't directly express. The gulf between what family members knew and didn't know was creating layers of miscommunication that would only become more complex as events unfolded. Kate watched this interaction from across the room while maintaining her own conversation with a group of young nobles involved in environmental activism. Her newly acquired knowledge cast every family interaction in a different light. She could see the strain in Camilla's face that William was missing, the careful way Charles was managing his energy, and the complete innocence of those who didn't yet know what was coming. The evening continued its elegant progression, but for those carrying the weight of secret knowledge, each moment felt charged with significance. Conversations that should have been routine became complicated by hidden meanings. Casual observations took on deeper implications. The very success of the royal family's public performance made the private reality more difficult to bear. As the evening progressed, the weight of unspoken truths began to create an almost palpable tension in the ballroom. Kate found herself studying Charles with new eyes, noticing subtle signs she had previously overlooked. The way he occasionally paused mid-sentence as if gathering energy, the careful way he positioned himself near walls or furniture that could provide discreet support, the slightly forced quality of his laughter during lighter moments. These observations were interrupted when Princess Anne approached Kate with her characteristic directness. As Charles's sister, Anne had always been known for her no-nonsense attitude and keen perception of family dynamics. Her years of royal service had given her an almost supernatural ability to sense when something significant was happening beneath the surface of formal events. "Kate, you look like someone who's just received rather serious news," Anne said quietly, her tone making it clear this wasn't a casual observation. "Care to share what's troubling you?" Kate felt her carefully maintained composure waver slightly. Anne's directness was legendary within the family, and attempting to deflect her concern would likely prove futile. However, the promise she had made to Charles to keep his confidence meant she couldn't share what she had learned, regardless of how perceptive Anne might be. "It's been a long evening," Kate replied carefully. "Sometimes these formal events can feel overwhelming even after all these years." Anne studied Kate's face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading between the lines of diplomatic conversations. Her experience in royal duties had taught her to distinguish between routine social fatigue and genuine distress. What she saw in Kate's expression fell decidedly into the latter category. "I see," Anne said simply, but her tone conveyed volumes about what she suspected but wouldn't directly address. "Well, if you need someone to talk to about anything at all, you know where to find me." The offer was both generous and loaded with meaning. Anne was letting Kate know that she was available for support, while also making it clear that she had noticed something significant was happening. It was the kind of sophisticated communication that royal family members had perfected over generations. Meanwhile, Charles had concluded his conversation with the military officers, and was moving toward a group that included several of his longtime friends from his Cambridge years. These were men he had known for decades, relationships that predated his royal responsibilities and provided a connection to a more normal existence. Tonight, however, even these comfortable friendships felt complicated by what he couldn't share. "Charles, you've been remarkably busy lately," observed Lord James Pemberton, a childhood friend who had maintained his relationship with the future king through decades of changing circumstances. The Environmental Summit, the Commonwealth Tour, the new charitable initiatives. "You're covering more ground than men half your age." The comment, meant as a compliment, struck Charles as both ironic and poignant. His increased activity wasn't a sign of renewed energy, but rather a desperate attempt to accomplish as much as possible while he still could. Every speech, every engagement, every policy initiative carried the weight of potentially being among his last as monarch. "There's always more work to be done," Charles replied. His standard response to such observations, "The privilege of service comes with the responsibility to use it effectively." His friends nodded approvingly, interpreting his words as noble dedication, rather than recognizing the urgency that actually drove his recent activities. The gap between perception and reality had become a constant feature of Charles's existence, making even intimate friendships feel somewhat isolated. Camilla continued to struggle with maintaining her public facade while processing the devastating implications of what she had witnessed. Her position by the windows had become both a refuge and a prison. It allowed her to observe without being constantly engaged, but it also left her alone with thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her composure. She watched William moving through the crowd with the easy confidence that would serve him well as king. His natural charisma and genuine interest in others made him effective in these social situations, qualities that would prove essential as he took on greater responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was essentially watching the future king practice for a role he didn't yet know he would soon inherit. The palace staff had begun the subtle preparations for the evening's conclusion. Silver trays appeared with small chocolates and coffee, signals that the formal portion of the event was drawing to a close. The photographers prepared for final group shots, and the string quartet selected pieces that would provide elegant background music for departures. Charles noticed these preparations and felt a complex mixture of relief and regret. Relief that he would soon be able to drop his public persona and process his emotions privately. Regret that this might be one of his last opportunities to host such a gathering as monarch, to bring together family and friends in the role that had defined his entire adult life. Kate found herself thinking about the practical implications of what Charles had shared. The transition he described would require careful coordination with government officials, constitutional experts, and Commonwealth leaders. The logistics alone would be enormously complex, involving everything from ceremonial protocols to legal documentation. Her mind began organizing the various elements that would need attention, a coping mechanism that helped her manage the emotional impact of the situation. As if reading her thoughts, Charles approached Kate once again, this time accompanied by Sir Edmund Fitzpatrick, the palace's senior constitutional advisor. The presence of this additional person suggested that the earlier conversation had been just the beginning of a much larger process. "Kate," Charles said quietly, "Sir Edmund and I will be meeting tomorrow morning to discuss the procedural aspects of what we talked about earlier. Your presence would be valuable, particularly regarding the public communication strategy." Sir Edmund nodded respectfully to Kate, his expression conveying both the gravity of the situation and his confidence in her ability to contribute meaningfully to these discussions. As one of the kingdom's leading experts in constitutional law, his involvement confirmed that Charles's plans were moving beyond private consideration into formal planning. "Of course," Kate replied, understanding that her role in the transition would be significant and multifaceted. "What time should I be there?" 10 o'clock in the private study, Charles answered. "We'll need to cover quite a bit of ground. And time is more precious than I initially realized." The reference to time carried ominous implications that weren't lost on Kate. Charles's medical situation was apparently more urgent than his initial description had suggested. The timeline for his transition plans was being compressed by factors beyond anyone's control. Across the room, William had finally noticed the subtle interactions between his father and wife. While he couldn't hear their conversations, The serious nature of their exchanges was evident in their body language. A growing sense of unease began to develop as he observed these private consultations happening within the larger social gathering. The evening was approaching its natural conclusion, but for several key participants it felt more like the beginning of something unprecedented and challenging. Secrets shared and secrets kept had created a complex web of awareness and ignorance that would shape family relationships in the difficult months ahead. The final hour of the evening brought a cascade of emotions that threatened to overwhelm even the most practiced royal composure. William's growing awareness that something significant was happening around him led to increased scrutiny of family interactions. His investigative instincts, honed through years of military service and royal responsibilities, began picking up on details that painted a concerning picture. During a brief moment when Charles stepped away to speak with palace security about departure arrangements, William approached Kate with the directness that characterized their marriage. Years of partnership had taught them to communicate efficiently even in public settings, using subtle cues and abbreviated conversations that wouldn't draw unwanted attention. "Something's happening," William said quietly, positioning himself so their conversation would appear casual to observers. "Father's been having private conversations all evening. You look like you've received earth-shattering news, and Camilla appears to be holding back tears. Care to enlighten me?" Kate felt her heart rate increase as she realized the impossible position she was in. Her loyalty to Charles's request for confidentiality conflicted with her commitment to complete honesty with her husband. The promise she had made earlier in the evening now felt like a trap that would force her to deceive the person she trusted most in the world. "It's complicated," Kate began, hoping to buy time while she figured out how to navigate this dilemma. "There are some family matters that need addressing, but it's not my place to discuss them without permission from those involved." William's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. In their years together, Kate had never evaded his direct questions about family matters. Her diplomatic non-answer told him more than a direct explanation might have, confirming that whatever was happening was both serious and sensitive. "Kate," William said, his voice carrying the authority that would soon make him king, "if this affects our family's future, I need to know. Whatever promises you've made can be adjusted based on the severity of the situation." Before Kate could respond, Charles returned from his security consultation, immediately noticing the intense conversation between his son and daughter-in-law. The timing couldn't have been worse. William's suspicions were clearly aroused, and Charles realized that his careful plan to control the flow of information was beginning to unravel. Camilla watched this three-way dynamic unfold from her position by the windows, understanding that the evening had reached a critical juncture. William's natural leadership instincts were asserting themselves as he sensed crisis, even without knowing its specific nature. The future king was beginning to emerge in response to circumstances he didn't yet fully understand. The remaining guests continued their conversations, oblivious to the family drama developing in their midst. Palace staff moved with practiced efficiency, managing the logistical aspects of the evening's conclusion while remaining alert to any signs that their services might be needed for more sensitive matters. Charles made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his carefully planned revelation. Approaching William and Kate, he spoke in a voice that carried unmistakable authority while remaining quiet enough to maintain privacy. "William, we need to talk," Charles said simply. "Not here, not tonight, but first thing tomorrow morning. The conversation Kate and I had earlier affects you more than anyone else." The formal way Charles addressed his son, combined with the serious tone of his voice, confirmed William's worst suspicions. This wasn't about minor family disagreements or routine royal business. Something fundamental was changing, and his father's reluctance to discuss it immediately suggested its gravity. "How serious are we talking?" William asked, his military training evident in the way he sought to assess the scope of the situation before developing a response strategy. "Life-changing for all of us," Charles replied, his honesty making the admission even more ominous. "But tonight isn't the time or place for that conversation. Tomorrow morning, 10:30 in my private study. Bring Kate with you." The slight modification to the meeting time Charles had mentioned earlier indicated that plans were being adjusted to accommodate William's inclusion. Kate understood that the dynamic of tomorrow's discussion would be completely different with William present. shifting from a consultation about supporting Charles's decisions to a family conference about shared responsibilities. As if sensing the tension developing within the family group, several other guests began gravitating toward them. Princess Anne approached with her characteristic directness, followed by Prince Edward and Sophie, both of whom had noticed the serious conversations happening throughout the evening. "Is everything all right over here?" Anne asked, her tone making it clear that she expected an honest answer, rather than diplomatic deflection. "The atmosphere seems rather heavy for a celebration." Charles found himself facing the choice between maintaining his planned timeline and acknowledging that circumstances were forcing more immediate disclosure. The presence of multiple family members, combined with William's obvious suspicions and Kate's visible distress, made continuing the evening's charade increasingly difficult. "We're fine," Charles said, though his words lacked conviction. "Just discussing some upcoming schedule changes that will affect various family responsibilities." Anne's expression indicated that she found this explanation entirely inadequate, but her respect for Charles's authority prevented her from pushing further in such a public setting. However, her look conveyed that she expected more complete information at an appropriate time and place. The palace's head butler approached discreetly, providing Charles with an opportunity to change the subject while addressing practical concerns. "Your Majesty, the final departure arrangements are ready when you are. The photographers have completed their work, and the staff is prepared to assist guests as needed." Charles nodded gratefully, recognizing the butler's sensitivity to the family dynamics playing out before him. The man's decades of service had taught him when to provide intervention through practical matters, allowing those involved to gracefully transition away from difficult moments. "Thank you, Harrison," Charles replied. "Please begin the departure process. I believe it's been a lovely evening, but all good things must come to an end." As guests began moving toward the exit procedures, the royal family found themselves in the awkward position of maintaining public pleasantries while managing private tensions. Handshakes, air kisses, and expressions of gratitude for the lovely evening were exchanged, but the undertone of unresolved family business created an undercurrent of strain. Camilla finally rose from her chair by the windows, understanding that her continued isolation was becoming noticeable to observant guests. She moved toward Charles with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to public appearances, but those who knew her well could see the effort required to maintain her composure. William and Kate positioned themselves to assist with departure courtesies, but their minds were clearly focused on the morning meeting that would finally provide answers to the questions that had been building throughout the evening. The night that had begun as a celebration was ending with the promise of revelations that would reshape their understanding of their family's future. As the last guests departed and the ballroom began to empty, the royal family members found themselves facing each other with a mixture of anticipation, concern, and barely contained emotion. The evening's secrets had created fault lines that would soon require careful navigation to prevent permanent damage to family relationships already strained by the pressures of public service and personal sacrifice. The morning after the ballroom gathering arrived with the weight of unfinished business hanging over the palace like a storm cloud. Charles had spent a sleepless night in his private chambers, alternating between reviewing constitutional documents and staring out at the gardens where dawn was slowly breaking. The decision to accelerate his timeline for sharing the truth with William had been necessary, but it also meant confronting the reality of his situation sooner than he had mentally prepared for. Camilla had remained equally wakeful, sitting in the chair by their bedroom window, wrapped in a silk robe, and watching the early morning light creep across the palace grounds. She had finally allowed herself to cry during the private hours before dawn, releasing the emotions she had been forced to contain throughout the previous evening. The tears had brought some relief, but they had also confirmed the devastating reality of what lay ahead. Kate had returned to Kensington Palace with William, both of them maintaining careful silence during the drive home. Their children were already asleep when they arrived, and the normalcy of checking on George, Charlotte, and Louis in their beds had provided a sharp contrast to the momentous changes being discussed in their parents' world. Kate had eventually shared the basics of Charles's revelation with William, understanding that arriving at the morning meeting without preparation would be unfair to everyone involved. William's reaction had been everything Kate had expected and feared. The initial shock gave way to anger at being excluded from such crucial information. followed by the practical concerns of someone suddenly facing enormous responsibility before he felt ready. They had talked until nearly 4 in the morning, working through the immediate implications and beginning to understand how fundamentally their lives were about to change. At precisely 10:30, William and Kate arrived at Charles's private study, a room they had visited countless times for family meetings and informal discussions. Today, however, the familiar space felt different. Sir Edmund Fitzpatrick was already present, surrounded by legal documents and constitutional references that provided silent testimony to the complexity of what they were about to discuss. Charles looked older than he had the previous evening, as if the act of sharing his secret had somehow accelerated the physical manifestation of his condition. He wore a simple suit rather than formal attire, but even in casual dress, he maintained the dignity that had characterized his entire approach to royal service. "Thank you both for coming," Charles began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I know last night raised more questions than it answered, and you deserve complete honesty about what we're facing." Camilla entered the study quietly, having spent the morning with her own constitutional advisor, discussing the role of the Queen Consort during a voluntary abdication. Her red-rimmed eyes told the story of her sleepless night, but her posture reflected her determination to support Charles through whatever lay ahead. William took his customary seat across from his father's desk, with Kate beside him in the chair she had occupied during countless family consultations over the years. The familiarity of their positions contrasted sharply with the unprecedented nature of what they were about to discuss. Sir Edmund cleared his throat diplomatically, understanding his role as both legal advisor and neutral facilitator for what was likely to be an emotional conversation. "Perhaps we should begin with the medical realities," he suggested, "and then move to the constitutional implications." Charles nodded, appreciating the structured approach that would help them work through the complexity systematically. "The doctors have been quite clear," he began, his clinical tone belying the personal devastation of his words. "The cancer has progressed beyond the point where aggressive treatment is advisable. We're looking at a prognosis measured in months rather than years." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. William had intellectually understood this possibility from Kate's earlier explanation, but hearing his father state it directly created an entirely different emotional impact. The man who had been a constant presence throughout his life, who had prepared him for royal responsibilities and supported him through personal challenges, was facing mortality in a very immediate way. "How long have you known?" William asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "The final confirmation came last week," Charles replied, "but I've suspected for several months that the treatments weren't working as effectively as the doctors initially hoped. I wanted to have a plan in place before sharing the news with family." Kate reached over to take William's hand, understanding that processing this information, while maintaining the emotional control expected of future monarchs, required enormous internal strength. The training they had all received in managing personal grief while maintaining public responsibilities had never felt more relevant or more difficult. Camilla spoke for the first time since entering the room, her voice hoarse from the previous night's tears but determined in its clarity. "Charles has decided that the most responsible approach is a voluntary transition of power. While he's still able to guide William through the initial stages of his reign, the constitutional implications of this decision were staggering. No British monarch had voluntarily abdicated since Edward VIII in 1936, and that crisis had nearly destroyed the monarchy. Charles was proposing to break with centuries of tradition based on the principle that duty continued until death, replacing it with a model based on practical responsibility and institutional stability. Sir Edmund opened one of his thick legal volumes, his scholarly demeanor providing a stabilizing presence as they navigated uncharted constitutional territory. "The legal mechanisms exist for voluntary abdication," he explained, "but the practical implementation will require careful coordination with Parliament, the Commonwealth realms, and various constitutional bodies." William felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders in a way that years of preparation hadn't quite accomplished. The theoretical future of his kingship was suddenly becoming immediate reality, with timelines measured in months rather than decades. Everything he had assumed about his life's trajectory was shifting beneath him. "What about the children?" Kate asked, thinking of their 3 young people who would need to understand why their grandfather was stepping down and why their father was becoming king sooner than anyone had expected. They'll need age-appropriate explanations, Charles replied, his voice softening as he thought of his grandchildren. George especially will require preparation for how this changes his own future responsibilities. But you and William have done an excellent job of giving them strong foundations. They'll adapt. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from ceremonial protocols to media management strategies. They discussed the timeline for various announcements, the coordination required with government officials, and the practical aspects of transferring constitutional responsibilities. Each detail reinforced the magnitude of what they were undertaking. As the meeting drew to a close, Charles stood and moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens. The same view that had provided him comfort during countless difficult decisions throughout his reign now offered a different kind of solace, the peace that comes with knowing that difficult decisions have been made responsibly, even when they require enormous personal sacrifice. I want you both to know, Charles said, still facing the window, that this decision isn't about giving up. It's about ensuring that the monarchy continues with strength and stability. William is ready for this responsibility, even if the timing isn't what any of us would have chosen. The meeting ended with embraces that carried the weight of both goodbye and beginning. As William and Kate prepared to leave, they understood that their lives had just changed in ways that would ripple through generations. The boy who had been born to be king would now assume that role in circumstances no one could have predicted, supported by a wife who had never imagined becoming queen quite so soon. 3 months later, the carefully orchestrated transition that had begun with whispered conversations in a palace ballroom reached its historic conclusion. The abdication ceremony took place in the same throne room where Charles had been crowned, creating a symbolic circle that honored both endings and beginnings. The event was witnessed by a small gathering of family members, constitutional officials, and Commonwealth representatives, each understanding they were participating in a moment that would reshape royal history. Charles had used his remaining months as monarch to prepare William for the responsibilities ahead with an intensity that surprised even those closest to the royal family. Daily briefings covered everything from state secrets to the subtle art of constitutional monarchy. Father and son had grown closer during this period than they had ever been, united by the shared understanding of duty and the precious nature of their remaining time together. The public announcement of Charles's decision had been met with a mixture of shock, admiration, and controversy that reflected the complexity of modern attitudes toward traditional institutions. Opinion polls showed the nation divided between those who praised his selfless decision to prioritize institutional stability and those who questioned the breaking of centuries-old precedent. Through it all, Charles had maintained his dignity, and William had demonstrated the steady leadership that would characterize his reign. Camilla had found unexpected strength in supporting Charles through his final months as king while preparing for her new role as the widow of a former monarch. Her transformation from controversial figure to beloved queen consort had been completed during this period, as the public witnessed her unwavering dedication to her husband's well-being and the institution they both served. The woman who had once been seen as a threat to the monarchy had become one of its most authentic defenders. Kate's evolution into queen consort had been remarkably smooth, building on years of preparation and her natural ability to connect with people from all backgrounds. Her approach to royal duties had always emphasized substance over ceremony, and this philosophy served her well as she assumed greater responsibilities. The children had adapted to their changed circumstances with the resilience of youth, though George had begun receiving more intensive preparation for his own future role. On the morning of the ceremony, the palace was filled with a mixture of solemnity and hope that captured the dual nature of the occasion. Charles dressed in the same formal robes he had worn for his coronation, but today they would be removed rather than bestowed. The symbolism was powerful and intentional, representing continuity within change and the peaceful transfer of power that characterized the British constitutional system at its best. William stood beside his father as the constitutional formalities were completed, each document signed representing another aspect of royal responsibility, passing from one generation to the next. The legal transfer of sovereignty was remarkably brief for something so historically significant, but the emotional weight of the moment extended far beyond the formal procedures. Princess Anne, as Charles's sister and the most senior member of the royal family after William, served as a witness to the proceedings. Her presence provided both constitutional legitimacy and family support during what was undoubtedly one of the most difficult days of Charles's life. Throughout the ceremony, she maintained the stoic composure that had characterized her decades of royal service. But those who knew her well could see the emotion she was managing beneath her formal exterior. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had overseen Charles's coronation years earlier, now presided over this unprecedented ceremony of voluntary relinquishment. His words emphasized the continuity of divine appointment and constitutional authority, framing Charles's decision as an act of service rather than abandonment. The religious elements of the ceremony provided comfort to those who saw the monarchy as divinely sanctioned while acknowledging the practical realities of human limitations. Camilla stood throughout the ceremony with tears streaming down her face, no longer needing to maintain the composed facade that royal protocol typically demanded. Her grief was not just for the end of Charles's reign, but for the reality of his shortened life and the future they would not have together. Yet her tears also carried pride for the dignity with which her husband was concluding his service to the nation. As the final documents were signed and the constitutional transfer completed, Charles removed the symbols of his monarchy for the last time. The crown was placed carefully on a velvet cushion, soon to be transferred to William's head. The orb and scepter followed, each representing aspects of royal authority that would now belong to his son. The physical act of relinquishment was brief, but it marked the end of a reign that had been defined by dedication, controversy, and ultimately selfless service. William's coronation followed immediately, creating a seamless transition that emphasized institutional continuity over personal change. As the crown was placed on his head, he understood that he was not just inheriting his father's role, but accepting responsibility for an institution that would outlast them all. Kate stood beside him, becoming queen consort in a moment that felt both inevitable and surreal. The ceremony concluded with Charles's first act as a private citizen in decades, embracing his son and daughter-in-law as family rather than as subjects. The gesture was captured by photographers and would become one of the defining images of the transition, representing both personal love and institutional stability during a period of unprecedented change. In the weeks that followed, Charles and Camilla retired to a private residence in Scotland, away from the public scrutiny that had defined their lives for so many years. Charles's health continued to decline, but he found peace in knowing that the monarchy was in capable hands, and that his decision to abdicate had been vindicated by William's smooth assumption of royal responsibilities. The ballroom where Charles had first shared his secret with Kate was once again filled with guests, this time celebrating William's first state banquet as king. The new monarch moved through the crowd with confidence and warmth, supported by Kate's natural grace and their shared commitment to modernizing the monarchy while respecting its traditions. The institution that had seemed threatened by change had instead been strengthened by the courage to embrace necessary transitions. As evening fell over the palace, the royal family gathered privately to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The whispered conversation that had begun in crisis had led to renewal, proving that even ancient institutions could adapt and thrive when guided by wisdom, love, and an unwavering commitment to service above self. The monarchy would continue, shaped by the courage of a king who knew when to step aside and the dedication of those ready to carry the crown forward into an uncertain but hopeful future.